History Lesson 6 Towns, Traders and Craftspersons. Students, I'll be explaining this lesson in two videos. This is the first video. The discovery of agriculture prompted early man to settle near his fields. Thus was laid the foundation of villages. When more and more people began to settle in these villages, gradually many of these developed into towns. With the passage of time, due to the activities of the rulers, religious persons, craftsmen, and traders, some of these towns flourished. They flourished as court towns or capitals, some as pilgrimage centers, some as port cities, and some others as trading towns and cities. Some of these towns were founded by different ruling dynasties, while others grew themselves as a result of the trading activities. Not only this, some of these towns were ravaged by the vigilance of nature or invaders, while others continued to flourish, and we can see them even today. Let us try to analyze the different categories of these towns and cities and trace the origin of some other towns. Now let us read about the administrative centers. In the Chola dynasty, the great ruler Raja Raja I, who ruled in AD 985 to 1016, built a grand temple in his capital called Tanjore or Tanjore, known as the Raja Rajeshwar Temple. This temple is dedicated to Lord Shiva. So sometimes this temple is also called as Shiva Temple of Tanjore. Its domes rise to a height of 190 feet or 60 meters like a pyramid and 13 successive stories. The perennial river Kaveri flows near this beautiful town. Remember, water supply to this town comes from wells and tanks and the perennial river which flows nearby, that is river Kaveri. One can hear the bells of Raja Rajeshwaram temple built by King Raja Raja Chola. The people are all praised for its architect Kanjavaram Raja Raja Peruthachan, who was proudly carved his name on the temple wall. Inside is a massive Shiva Linga. Besides the temple, there are palaces with mandaps or pavilions. Kings hold their meetings over here. There are also barracks for the army. These towns have markets selling grain, spices, cloth, and jewelry. Water supply for the town comes from wells and tanks. The Salia weavers of Tanjore and the nearby town of Uriayur are busy producing cloth for flags to be used in the temple festival. Fine cottons for the king and the nobility and coarse cotton for the masses. Some distance away at Swamimalai, the sthapatis or sculptors are making exquisite bronze idols and tall ornamental bell metal lamps. Other than this, I must tell you, under the Delhi Sultans, Delhi served as their capital. Under the Mughals, Delhi, Agra, Lahore, and Fatehpur Sikri served as their capital centers. Now, let's move on to the temple towns and pilgrimage centers. Some of the towns developed as temple towns and pilgrimage centers. The chief among them are Kurukshetra, Sanchi, Sarnath, Bodh Gaya, Haridwar, Badrinath, Kedarnath, Mathura, Allahabad, Banaras, Jagannath Puri, Bhubaneswar, Dwarkapuri, Sringeri, Kanchipuram, Tanjavur, Madurai, Tirupati, Delhi, Fatehpur Sikri, Ajmer, Nanaka Sahib, Amritsar, and Patna, etc. Tanjore is also an example of a temple town. The temple towns represent a very important pattern of urbanization, the process by which cities develop. Temples were often central to the economy and society. Rulers built temples to demonstrate their devotion to various deities. They also endowed temples with grants of land and money to carry out elaborate rituals, feed pilgrims and priests, and celebrate festivals. Pilgrims who flocked to the temples also made donations. Have a look at this statue, which is made of bronze, an alloy, or a copper and tin. Their technique of making statue is known as wax technique. The image of the deity was made of wax and then it was covered with clay and allowed to dry. When it was heated, the wax would come out and then molten metal was poured into the clay mold. Thus, metal statues were made and kept in temples. We know that Chola rulers were great builders of temples and they adorned their temples with beautiful statues made of bronze. Many rulers built the temples to show their devotion to different gods and goddesses whom they worshipped. Temple authorities used their wealth to finance trade and banking. Large number of priests, workers, artisans, traders, etc. They settled near the temple to take care of the needs and those of the pilgrims. Thus grew temple towns. Towns emerged around temples such as those of Bilaswami, Bhilsa or Vidisha in Madhya Pradesh and Somnath in Gujarat. Other important temple towns included Kanchipuram and Madurai in Tamil Nadu and Tirupati in Andhra Pradesh. Pilgrimage centers also slowly developed into townships. Let's see an example of Vrindavan of Uttar Pradesh and Tiruvannamalai of Tamil Nadu. They are also known as the pilgrimage centers and they developed into townships. Ajmer in Rajasthan was the capital of Chauhan kings in the 12th century and later became the Suba headquarters under the Mughals. It provides an excellent example of religious existence. Now let's read about a network of small towns. We see that from the 8th century onwards, the subcontinent was dotted with several small towns, and then they emerged from large villages. They usually had a mandapika or mandi of later times, to which nearby villages brought their produce to sell. They also had street markets which were called as haat, and these were lined with shops. There were different kinds of artisans such as potters, oil pressers, sugar makers, toddy makers, smiths, stonemasons, etc. While some traders lived in the town, others traveled from town to town. Many came from far and near to these towns to buy local articles and sell products of distant places like horses, salt, camphor, saffron, betel nut, and the spices like pepper. Almost all the capital towns, pilgrimage centers, and port towns were hub of trading activities. But some towns acquired importance especially for their trading activities. The great reputation that India acquired in the commercial field continued during this period, that is, 8th to the 18th century. A great variety of Indian goods, especially cloth and spices, had a great demand all over the world, especially in the Western countries and the European world. That is why a large number of Arab, Persian, Jewish, and Syrian traders visited the town on the west coast. These traders took these articles to the Red Sea port where the Indian traders bought them and eventually took them to the European markets and earned high profits. The Indian traders had organized themselves into guilds to protect their rights. In South India, some of such guilds, as Nana Desi and Manigranam, acquired great name and fame. They traded extensively within the country and also with Southeast Asia and China. There were also some communities like the Marwari Oswals, the Hindumanias, and Muslim Bohras who traded extensively with the ports of the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and China. Kabul, in present day Afghanistan, became politically and commercially important from the 16th century onwards. They trade in horses. Camels carried dried fruits, dates, carpets, silks, and even fresh fruits from Kabul to the subcontinent and elsewhere. Slaves were also brought here for sale. The craftspersons of Bidar were so famed for their inlay work in copper and silver that it came to be called Bidri. The Panchalas or Vishwakarma community, consisting of goldsmiths, bronzesmiths, blacksmiths, masons, and carpenters, were essential to the building of temples. They also played an important role in the construction of palaces, big buildings, tanks, and reservoirs. Weavers such as the Salyar or Kaikolars emerged as prosperous communities, making donation to the temples. Some aspects of cloth making, like cotton cleaning, spinning, and dyeing, became specialized and independent crafts.